let's start it. All right, so the title of the talk is The Saint and the Prime Minister of Hell, Treasure, Stewardship, and Dispensation in 19th Century Iberian Cyprian Literature. It's a bit of a long-winded title. I wanted to make it more poetic, but I wasn't witty enough. Basically, this talk the point is to focus a particular set of documents, some of which I had known about for a while, and others which are recent discoveries, but which, when placed together, started to reveal something particular about the 19th century conceptions of books of St. Cyprian in Iberia, and in particular, the interactions that this had with the Grand Grimoire. For those who don't know, the Grand Grimoire is early 18th century Italian and French grimoire. It inserts itself in the general Solomonic magic tradition. It uses mostly Solomonic methods to summon and constrain spirits. And one of the things it has is a very extensive section about treasure hunting. And the methodologies that the Grand Grimoire prescribes is the summoning of one particular spirit, Lucifuge Rofocale, the Prime Minister of Hell and Steward of all buried treasures. So to now, there is these 19th century documents I'm talking about. There is what appears to be a proximity or an approximation between Lucifuge Rofocale as, let's say, a character, a grimoire character, or even you can call it a literary character, and Saint Cyprian in the context of the Iberian books. So my point is just to go into that, but I'm going to take the long road there because the documents are complex in themselves, and in order to get there to the 19th century, I'm going to go over very quickly the known history of the Iberian Cyprian books. Then I'm going to focus a little bit on the printed books that also appear in the 19th century, and then I'm going to really focus on this set of documents and what this might mean. So, starting now. St. Cyprian historical summaries, 16th and 17th century. So, books of St. Cyprian in the Iberian Peninsula, we don't know exactly when they start circulating. The first instance that is known of them is 1610, the denunciation against Juan de Toledo. Now, this is a new one for me. I didn't discover this one. This had already been discovered, this mention, quite a long time ago. I only recently became aware of it. And it's not exactly a trial, it's a denunciation, just a small piece of text of somebody claiming that this individual, Juan de Toledo, was walking around with two books in his possession. One explicitly mentioned as a Libro de San Cipriano, or a book of St. Cyprian, and another one which is referred to as a Picatrix. Now, just right here, besides the certainty that objects known as books of St. Cyprian already existed in 1610, and this object didn't appear to be a novelty, so probably books of St. Cyprian appeared before 1610. Also, the issue of this individual having a book called Picatrix is also quite interesting. Usually, the Picatrix, when you find a reference to a book called Picatrix, it's usually a reference to a very large, extensive, and complex book, a translation of an Arabic text called the Hayat al-Hakim, which was translated in Spain, in Castile, in Toledo. It was translated into Castilian and Latin, and then the Latin version got really widely disseminated, and it's a fundamental text, not only in the development of early modern magic and astral magic, but also particularly it's important for even the history of Western philosophy. By its sorry, I'm just trying to get something. Okay. By its influence on the notions of occult virtues that are become kind of fundamental for the later developments of what you would call science. However, while this tends to be the general perception of Apicatrix, I have found that in the 17th century, when in Iberia you find books called Picatrix, most often these are not the regular Picatrix. During this time period, we do have these references, but when the contents of these books are described, they don't match the regular Picatrix. So Picatrix in the Iberian Peninsula in the 17th century was actually a category of books, these smaller books of astral magic that were circulating around. So this man having a Picatrix does not mean it was the Picatrix. So this was a bit of a detour. The denunciation of Juan de Toledo does mention something quite interesting, which is that he was using these books apparently to find treasure. This is interesting because as time moves on, the books of St. Cyprian do become heavily associated with treasure hunting, but we have a guarantee that they were also apparently being used for this purpose already in the early 17th century. So, besides this, then the next case we have is that of Pedro Afonso from 1620, so 10 years after the Juan de Toledo case. This is in Portugal, and again, it explicitly mentions a book called Livro de São Cipriano, or again in Portuguese, Book of St. Cyprian. Now, contrarily to the Juan de Toledo book, which we don't actually have any descriptions of, we just know that he had it, we do have some information about the content of the Pedro Afonso book, in that it contained basically medical or magical healing procedures, both for natural and supernatural illnesses, just scrofula or paralysis, or the management of the evil eye or evil spirits. And that apparently, fundamental within the conception of this book, or the very purpose of it, its perceived authority, was that it contained the prayer of St. Cyprian. The prayer of St. Cyprian is a widely distributed magical religious text. It's used all over Europe, all over just the West in general, air quotes, West. And it's usually used as a method to banish evil spirits, frequently associated with illness too. Now, it seemed that the presence of the prayer of St. Cyprian within this book kind of, there was a contagion of the virtues of the prayer of St. Cyprian to this book, as some of the procedures in the Pedro Afonso book were time dependent, that he could only do them on Sundays, which is something that's somewhat common among some prayers of St. Cyprian, that you are only supposed to read them on Sundays, and that the book also had talismanic properties which are the same as usually attributed to this prayer of St. Cyprian. So it was not only the content, the written content that was important, it was the book itself, that it was itself a talisman and could kind of heal people. Now, another procedure which shows up in this book is kind of an elaborate type of procedure, which Pedro Afonso would take an individual usually to a bridge, and then he would cross this bridge a couple of times with a sword, and he would make some bloodlettings with this sword and make all sorts of complex rituals. Now, this was a healing ritual, which tends to be, the preoccupations tend to be more associated with folk magic, but the elaborate procedures that were used in this particular healing are more akin to learned magic, so that there is somewhat of an overlap between folk magic preoccupations and learned magic methodologies happening in this book. Now, thankfully, it's this one instance, this procedure, that kind of guarantees that the Book of St. Cyprian of Pedro Afonso is not isolated in history. We don't have any other references to books of St. Cyprian in the 17th century, but this element guarantees that this book had connections to other forms of practices happening around. Because if we look at the Portuguese Inquisition, there are several other cases, mostly focused on the Portuguese north, of other individuals performing this same ritual. And importantly, it should be noted that while all these individuals worked mostly in a folk magic environment, they were not themselves without education. Pedro Afonso himself he was an illiterate farmer, but he was an extremely wealthy farmer, so he had access to a variety of other resources, be them oral or simply contacts with local doctors or perhaps, we don't know, but perhaps magical practitioners. So it seems that the books of St. Cyprian, or at least the version that Pedro Afonso was using, emerges out of a certain environment of magic practice that was happening at this time in the Portuguese north, although we don't have too much information on this. And also importantly, in the trial, Pedro Afonso does mention that he had owned his book since for 30 years, which places the creation of his book in the late 16th century. And he mentions that it was copied from an older book. So the second half or the late 16th century seems to be the earliest date we can push the creation of the St. Cyprian books in Portugal too. Now it should also be noticed that this overlap of folk and learned methodologies, the books of St. Cyprian aren't the only books that come out of this. There are other examples. Other types of books who kind of died out in history. We don't have much records of them, although sometimes we can find them, particularly in the Inquisition. This is a particular case I have managed to locate. This is basically a magic book that was written by an illiterate individual. So it's basically entirely pictorial. It has simulated writing. Again, this is a complicated one to deal with. I hope to eventually publish this. But, the Inquisition eventually did press this guy enough that he admitted that the devil made him do it. And basically this was like the devil gave him the book and instructed him how to read it. So this is a really interesting thing. But, just to point out, books of St. Cyprian aren't the only things happening in this time period. So now we move on. We only have two mentions in the 17th century. Next, the 18th century. Now there is a shift in the Cyprian books in this century. Namely that, first of all, we have a lot more references to books of St. Cyprian in the 18th century than before. And most of these put books of St. Cyprian as being focused on treasure hunting, although not exclusively. Now, collecting all the references in the Inquisition to these books... Oh, sorry, skipped a bit. Now, treasure hunting in Iberia is particular, and it tends to focus on what's usually called Moorish treasure. Moorish treasure, it's treasure being guarded by what's called a Mora Encantada. Now, this is a really complicated thing to talk about, and it would be really a big detour to talk about it here. But basically, Moras Encantadas take the position in Iberia typically given to, like, fairies in, like, say, England. And these tend to be treasure guardians. And the books of St. Cyprian in this period are not solely just treasure hunting books. They are treasure hunting books specialized in the discovery of Moorish treasure. So they have an irreducible folkloric component to them, or the way that people interacted with them was from within a certain folkloric and contextual context. Now then, collecting all the references to Cyprian books, we have 7 of them. Should be noted that out of these 7, 6 refer treasure hunting in some way or another. And that, so they are largely treasure hunting books, but again, not exclusively. Now, contrarily to the 17th century, these several mentions to treasure hunting Cyprian books, we do have more of a solid bedrock to look at them from, as until the earliest known manuscript Book of St. Cyprian is precisely an 18th century book and is precisely a treasure hunting book. And this is manuscript 2559, that's in the reserved section here at the University of Coimbra. And this is a book that is largely coincides with the descriptions of Cyprian books as in the 18th century. So we do know that this book isn't just a random object that just shows up. There are records of other books similar to these being used. And on the other side of the coin, those mentions in the Inquisition aren't spurious. People weren't just simply making them up, because they do correspond to a manuscript that we know is real. Now, there is some good news in this regard, as more recently, the great researcher Felix Castro Vicente, he discovered a second manuscript book of St. Cyprian. So the Coimbra book is not the only book currently known. As far as he told me, I believe this new manuscript is in private hands. He did take photos of it and show them to me. Obviously, I'm not going to talk extensively about it. It's his research. He's the one that should publish it at his leisure. I can say that it's written in Latin, which is contrary to the Coimbra book, which is written in Portuguese. It's vernacular, and it's very visually striking. Has plenty of magic circles. So there's some awesome stuff coming in from Felix whenever he chooses to publish it, obviously. Now, arriving at the 19th century. The Portuguese Inquisition does last a very long time, and in the 19th century we still have a trial mentioning books of St. Cyprian. This is the 1802 trial of Rafael Lopes Fonseca. He was a priest from Braga, a famed exorcist. The book that it's mentioned seems to be interesting. He was mostly using it as a tool of exorcism, which makes sense, probably using the prayer of St. Cyprian. But also, besides this, he was also using it to hunt treasure, so it makes sense in this continuity with the 18th century. In particular, the Raphael book seems to already contain some elements which, as the 19th century moves ahead, become common points with the printed books, namely the use of divination such as cusinomancy, although this is a bit of a not a very solid indication of continuity. But what it does also mention is the use of the term open body or corpo aberto, which is a very specific northern Portuguese type of definition. An open body is what we in contemporary times would call just a medium, so just somebody who is able to receive spirits in their body, and it's a concept that's very underlined in the printed Portuguese book right now. And the Raphael book was already talking about it as in its context of exorcism, which is the same as the printed book. So anyway, moving ahead, we enter the printed books. There is a great deal of unknown regarding the first versions of the printed book of St. Cyprian, be it in Portugal or Spain. Sometimes we find records from some ethnographers or folklorists talking about the variations of books of St. Cyprian during their time. And we do know that there were versions of the book which today are completely unknown. So there's still a lot to be discovered about this. However, out of all of that mix of confusion and various publications, one does seem to rise up to relevance. And that is the true and last book of St. Cyprian. It is unsure when this one got published, but it's an interesting version. It's a rather extensive book, contains 2 parts. Among its content is it has uses for the prayer of St. Cyprian as a method of exorcism, which makes sense with the 17th century books. It also has a second use for the prayer of St. Cyprian as a treasure hunting tool, which makes sense with the 18th century books, and then has also a bunch of loose magical procedures and various forms of divination. Now, in a short time, this book generates 2 offshoots, one which is typically found printed in the city of Porto, and I usually call it the Porto book, which is a smaller version of the true and last book of St. Cyprian, mostly composed of divination and reduced procedures that are found in the true and last book of St. Cyprian. And then, after this, another version of the book comes up, which is consistently printed in Lisbon, hence I call it the Lisbon book, which contains the entirety of the content of the true and last book, plus it contains an extra 3rd part. Now, this Lisbon book is what contemporarily makes up the regular Portuguese book of St. Cyprian. If in Portugal you go to a bookstore and you ask for a book of St. Cyprian, most likely this is what you'll get, unless the guy has some Brazilian versions there. This is the current standard Portuguese book of St. Cyprian. And this is the book that is eventually also taken to Brazil, and then it creates its own offshoots over there. All right. The Spanish side of the situation is entirely distinct. Like I said, we don't know much about the early versions of the book over there. One that seems to catch on and also gain considerable relevance is simply called Libro de San Cipriano, or Book of St. Cyprian. And it's typically, its opening text attributes it to the Spanish monk Jonas Sulfurino, or Sulphury Jonas, the German monk from the mountains of Brocken, who apparently claims to have received the book from the devil. Now, this book isn't, it has elements which are similar to the Portuguese versions, meaning that along the line, these two books communicated, they are not separated from each other radically. But besides these similarities to the Portuguese versions, there are also clear influences from non-Iberian grimoires, which during this time, the printing press was becoming, printed books were becoming cheaper and cheaper, and there was rise in literacy, so there were plenty of non-Iberian books coming into the Iberian Peninsula and influencing the local literature. So this book does contain clear elements taken from, for example, the Black Pullet, and more relevantly, the Grand Grimoire. The presence of the Grand Grimoire in this book is really important because this book, while still having a section focused on treasure hunting, largely forgoes the use of the Prayer of St. Cyprian like the Portuguese book, and instead uses the procedure to summon the spirit Lucifuge Rofocale as its method of treasure hunting. Now, the Grand Grimoire will continue throughout the 19th century to have a very large influence on the Spanish books, continuously, up until this point. But still, beyond this book itself, this book also generates its own offshoots, its own continuations. One of these is La Maria Suprema Negra Roja y Infernal, which was very recently, I think last year maybe, published by Hadean Press. I'm not sure the title that was given, probably La Maria Negra Rosa Infernal. The I don't know, Supreme Magic Black, Red and Infernal, I suppose. And then besides this, this is a book that claims explicitly to be a sequel to the Sulfurino book. Besides this, then there is another variation, which usually is called El Libro Infernal, or the Infernal book, which contains the entirety of the Sulfurino book within it, plus a whole bunch of other stuff taken from the Petit and the Grand Albert and the Key of Solomon. So it's really like this huge compilation of magical material. Now, besides this line of the Sulfurino book, Spain does have a few other variations, among which the Grand Grimoire tends to be relevant. One important book which keeps popping up, keeps tormenting me, is the Heptameron, the Cyprian Heptameron, distinct from the pseudo-Abano Heptameron. This is probably the earliest printed book of St. Cyprian, and interestingly, the only mention to Cyprian is in the title page. There is nothing within the text that suggests anything Cyprian related explicitly, at least. It's possible the book is mostly composed of divination with some weird Paracelsian influences, which might indicate a certain German influence, because there are German Cyprian Heptamerons, in case people didn't know. Those things exist. So there might be something here, but at this point it's entirely unclear to me. And then you also have other books that kind of come close or more or less close to the Cyprian books, such as Los Secretos del Inferno, which is basically just a publication of the Grand Grimoire. You will frequently just find the Grand Grimoire published in Spain as a book of St. Cyprian. It continues to have that influence. Now, and it is here. This is where I wanted to get at. All this talk, just to get here, to the influence of the Grand Grimoire on the books of St. Cyprian. This is what I want to talk about. Now, there is, besides the 18th century cases I mentioned, there is an extra case, which I hid until right now. And this is an Inquisition case in the Portuguese Inquisition, late 18th century, 1784. This is a story of a treasure hunting party. And, these were just a bunch of guys from a few neighboring villages who were going around the Portuguese north trying to find treasure. And they keep talking about a book of St. Cyprian. They are using a book of St. Cyprian to find these treasures. However, one of them apparently was not a local, was a man called Vicente Morrigani or Murrigoni. The name kind of suggests that he might have been Italian, although this is never clarified. And he is mentioned as being a vedore, which is a category of individuals in Portugal that they claim to be able to see inside the earth and inside human bodies. So they're the type of guy who would usually be part of a treasure hunting party. And the book of St. Cyprian that these guys kept talking about was his. He owned this book. And what's interesting is whenever anybody mentions any of the content of this supposed Cyprian book, it very clearly, it's a Grand Grimoire. And this is actually a section from the trial. Making a triangle with a bloodstone in the location of the treasure, being inside this and having in his hands a hazel rod and saying these formal words, O Lucifuge Astoti, Prince of all spirits, show thou not favor me in this quest with the largest and closest treasure, I shall punish thee with the great words of the clavicula, and hitting the ground with the rod would the treasure be unearthed and cast out. So this is clearly a section of the Grand Grimoire, which now generates a bit of a problem for an individual such as myself. For the longest time, I thought that the influence of the Grand Grimoire was nearly exclusive to the Cyprian books, because to the Spanish Cyprian books, because we did see that this influence was still present today. But a case such as this guarantees that Grand Grimoires were circulating in Portugal in the late 18th century and they were being looked upon as books of St. Cyprian. Now, obviously, there are a few points that we can't resolve here, such as, was this a book that had the content of the Grand Grimoire, but was it actually titled Book of St. Cyprian? Or was it simply a Grand Grimoire that, simply because it was about treasure hunting, the locals were interpreting it as a Book of St. Cyprian? We cannot know this. But what it does guarantee was that in the 18th century in Portugal, we already had the proximity of the Grand Grimoire and the local books of St. Cyprian. Now, this isn't the only case, and these two cases I already mentioned them in the Opuscula Cypriani, but these two cases now gain a different weight to them. So there's an ethnographer in the 19th century, Portuguese guy called Francisco Martins Sarmento. He was mostly active in Guimarães, which is typically kind of a hotspot for Cyprian books, and he claims to have examined at some point what he mentions being two books of St. Cyprian. He does not clarify if these were printed or if these were manuscript. And the notes that he took were never published. So they are in his personal notebooks that if you want to check them, you actually need to go to Guimarães and visit his personal library. Anyway, he analyzed two books. One of these he refers to by the name of Pai Santo, Livro de São Cipriano, or Holy Father, Book of St. Cyprian. Now, while he doesn't mention this, if you analyze the text that he has, his notes, you very clearly and very quickly identify that this is kind of a mix of elements from the Grimoire of Pope Honorius and elements from the Pseudo-Abano Heptameron. But this wasn't solely a passive copy-paste of content to make a new Cyprian book. This was an active process by which the elements from these two books are combined to make one single ritual, and this ritual is specifically tailored to find treasure in a Portuguese context, meaning Moorish treasure. So it's an appropriation of local culture of the methodologies of these two books. Now, the other book that Martins Sarmento analyzed, he mentions as Livro do Rei São Cipriano, or Book of King St. Cyprian. It's a similar situation to the previous one, but it simply uses the methodologies of the Grand Grimoire mixed with local Cyprian books. So there are elements which are similar to manuscript 2559, the one that we have here in Coimbra. Once again, this isn't a passive copy-paste. This is an adaptation of the Grand Grimoire ritual mixed with Cyprian local elements to make a new kind of treasure hunting book tailored for specific Portuguese preoccupations. Now, another book, and this is again another of the recent discoveries of Félix Castro Vicente, is a book that he found, or at least it's claimed to have been found, in St. Cyprian Church near Toledo, hidden inside some liturgical literature. And it's titled, this is a printed book, by the way, El Verdadero Libro de San Cipriano, or True Book of St. Cyprian. The titles tend to get repetitive. And it's a very similar situation to what Francisco Martins Sarmiento mentioned. But simply, this is a combination of the Heptameron and the Grand Grimoire. And besides this, there are sections of this book which, again, he took photos, I saw the photos. There are sections of this book which I can't identify as belonging to any previous text. So they might be original content that's also mixed into all of this. And when you follow the Heptameron methodologies and the Grand Grimoire methodologies, it mentions a few spirit names. These are them: Lucifer, Astaroth, Lucifuge, and Rofocale as two distinct names. Two different, so it's the spirit Lucifuge and the spirit Rofocale, not one single spirit, so two spirits. So let's take a step back. The summary of this whole thing. In the 16th and 17th century, books of St. Cyprian show up, wherever they came from. They are mostly focused on folk magic, although there are early mentions to them being used in treasure hunting. In the 18th century, they mostly become treasure hunting books. And when we arrive at the 18th century, we have this influx of external magical literature, non-Iberian magical literature, that goes into the Iberian Cyprian books. More relevantly of them all is the Grand Grimoire, which really sticks to the Spanish Cyprian books. The Portuguese Cyprian books, whatever their interactions with the Grand Grimoire were, those interactions seem to die out as the 19th century moves on. But there is a point there, which is only now becoming clear, and which I'm really interested in. And these examples I gave aren't the only overlaps of the Grand Grimoire with the Portuguese Cyprian books. For there is another book, a book titled Cypriani Magici Septem Ora Magicae. Now, this is an interesting one. This is a mysterious book. I recently discovered this book in the Portuguese National Library. I'm not the first one to discover this book. The first mention that this book ever had was in a publication by a guy called Francisco Adolfo Coelho, Notas e Paralelos Folclóricos, Tradições Relativas a São Cipriano. This was an article published in 1888. It's the first, let's say, academic, air quotes, academic article on books of St. Cyprian and St. Cyprian traditions. And in it, Francisco Adolfo Coelho does mention a whole bunch of varieties of printed Cyprian books that we today don't have any clues on. So he actually is the only lead we have into those early printed books. But among all of these, the highlight of this article is that Adolfo Coelho mentions having examined what he calls an authentic book of St. Cyprian, which belonged to a gentleman called António da Silva Túlio, who at the time was one of the curators of the Portuguese National Library. And he actually copies a couple of paragraphs from that book into his paper. Now, this section here, I've probably published this section of text more often. I think every time I mention books of St. Cyprian anywhere, I quote this, because it's a really like an outlier. It's a good showcase for the heterogeneity that books of St. Cyprian can have. But Francisco Adolfo Coelho, he does admit with some sorrow that besides this one paragraph, he could not examine the book at length as António da Silva Túlio died in 1884, and the book kind of disappeared. Nobody knows what happened to the book. Now, about 140 years later, I'm examining the manuscript section of the Portuguese National Library. I'm examining the analog catalog, which is basically just a few hundred drawers, each of them with a few hundred like little cards with book references on them. And I run across this. This is a card for a book called Septenora Magica, authored by Cyprian Saint. I immediately knew what this referred to, so I asked for this book, and this is what came back. So this is the same book that Adolfo Coelho analyzed in 1884, and we can tell there's a stamp on the upper left-hand side called Compra, reading Compra. This indicates that the National Library bought this book after the death of António da Silva Túlio. His library was auctioned, and apparently they bought the whole thing, and inexplicably, Adolfo Coelho didn't bother checking the library for it. So anyway, I found the book, finally. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to examine it at this time. There's a whole story now that me and Hadean Press, and Erzbet in particular, we managed to convince the director of the manuscript section of the National Library of Portugal to push this to the top of the restoration list of the library and digitalize it as quickly as possible. And that happened, fortunately. This is how it looks like now. If you go to the website of the Portuguese National Library, you are able to download this. This is how it looks like right now. Now, and this is a spectacular example. It's something that, and I say this with joy, this destroys most of my theories regarding Cyprian books, and that's good. So right off the bat, this is how it opens. The book is it's very hard to read. It's a really broken Latin. It seems to at times be written in the first person, like Cyprian is writing it. It claims that this is a book of Cyprian that uses the magic of Lucifuge, Rofocale, and is specialized in the finding of Moorish treasure, Muslim treasure, so Mora treasure. Now this is basically... This immediately includes Lucifuge Rofocale, the spirit from the Grand Grimoire, as part of a folk conception of buried treasure and treasure guardians in Iberia. Basically, the stewardship of buried treasure is being given in this text to Lucifuge Rofocale, which immediately places him at the top of a hierarchy of Moras, basically fairies. So it folklorizes Lucifuge Rofocale in the Portuguese context. Now, the book is rather short. It opens by giving you instructions on to create something that it calls a talisman, which is this outlandishly cumbersome and large kind of mechanism that's made from several woods, cut in different hours, and it's huge. It's supposed to somehow have all these rotating parts, and it's all their rotation somehow point to treasure. And after this, it has instructions on how to make a pact with Lucifuge, complete with instructions on a magical circle, recipe for magical candles, and a magical oil. And it is this part which is my favorite, because, remember, Lucifuge comes from the Grand Grimoire, which is a text inserted in the Solomonic tradition. And this explicitly breaks away from the Solomonic tradition. This is an actual quote from the pact. I trust in all that your magical hours hold, and Lucifuge, and the influx of the planets. I deny that your magic systems, Adam, Noah, Solomon, David, and the three kings, are truly magical, and magic talismans are necessary for my work. So this denies the use of divine authority for magic, which is basically the basis of Solomonic magic. You use divine names and divine authority to summon spirits and force them to obey you. You constrain and even, if necessary, torture them. The Grand Grimoire is big on spirit torture. This just says all of that is garbage. The right way to work with Lucifuge and to find treasure with Lucifuge is by making a pact with him. So it takes the opposite road. Then afterwards, after you do the pact, there is a ritual to make the talisman work. And the ritual itself also resembles a black mass, that you are supposed to eat the communion host, and you have to read certain liturgical passages. And basically that's kind of what the book is. So, what are the conclusions here? Now, as you notice, I like to wing it, but I wrote this down because this is really nice and complicated. All right. The gradual identification of the Cyprian books as treasure hunting literature in the 18th century, with all its irreducible folkloric aspects, created a number of idiosyncrasies with the approach of the 19th century and its open and international distribution of occult literature. Books which had their own local significances and genealogies in other geographies, when introduced to the Iberian landscape, were treated and referred to as books of St. Cyprian, on an apparent basis of their perceived purpose, and were gradually integrated into this literary tradition. While there are several known international grimoires which underwent this process, one among these which gained a solid foothold in Iberia, and one which is still identifiable as a major influencer in the contemporary Spanish books of St. Cyprian, is the Grand Grimoire. The Grand Grimoire, while fitting the more general Solomonic magic trend, describes a rather unique treasure hunting methodology, placing all buried treasures under the stewardship of one single and specific spirit, one which is given active voice and personhood within its text. With the tutelage of treasure hunting books in Iberia being given to Cyprian, and the stewardship of buried treasure being gradually offered to Lucifuge Rofocale, this inevitably generated the relationship between these two figures. Such a relationship was not immediate or homogeneous among titles, and several iterations of this can be found. Of those so far located, the one which most clearly and explicitly formalizes this relationship is the Septem Ora Magicae. This is a book attributed to Cyprian, written in the first person. Yet, the magic it relates to the reader is that of Lucifuge, not only the natural guardian and steward of buried riches, but in particular those attributed to Mouros and Mouras. In this relationship, Cyprian does not portray himself as a Solomonic magician, constraining and forcing Lucifuge to action. Much to the contrary, he denounces divine magic and instead offers the methods to access Lucifuge by the performance of a pact and a recourse to mechanical implements and natural/astral powers. It is unknown if this is the only instance of such a radical and interesting departure from the treasure hunting methodologies of both Cyprianic and Solomonic traditions, or if this book represents a yet unknown stream of Iberian magic literature we are only now beginning to perceive. Be it as it may, in it Cyprian and Lucifuge are presented as two sides of the same coin, not antagonistic but complementary forces in the management of hidden riches and the stewards and dispensators of buried treasure. Thank you.